Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked,
and sometimes what didn't,
you will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts
And inspire you to do even greater things.
I continue my conversation with Karthik Viswanathan, the President of Ochyo Inc., a consulting firm that specializes in serving state and local governments around strategy development, technology enablement, and business process optimization. In the previous part, I asked Karthik about prioritization, how the requests from different departments and programs are taken up, considering the constraints of budget and bandwidth. In this part of our conversation, Karthik delves deeper into the challenges and opportunities within government IT. He discusses the complexities of balancing top-down mandates with bottom-up needs, particularly in large decentralized organizations. Some of the key points that came up are about the government structure, adoption of technology in government, managing talent when working for the government, intergovernmental or interdepartmental collaborations, and how consulting and government work together. Overall, we touched upon a lot of topics, and not many people would have the experience of working both in the private sector and in the government, both inside and as a partner. Listen on.
Great question. So I'll take the technical or like the operational side first, and then we can talk about the political side. On the operational aspect, if there is an existing project which is in flux, again, I'm going to decouple the federal government because federal government is a lot more disoriented, at least in the compared to how things are operated at state and local, because of how the whole funding cycle works on the federal side, because they work from one fiscal year to another versus looking at anything from a long-term planning. And the three pieces of government which comes in, how the legislature funds at the federal level versus what, let's say, the executive office wants to do. At the state level, what tends to happen is you have the executive office, which is the governor or the secretaries who come in with the governor into any new administration. But then there is the operational side, which is the next tier of directors who are there. So the directors are the ones who've been there within those agencies for longer periods of time. They kind of understand what the needs are on a daily basis. The other thing at a state government level that doesn't change is those 6 or 7 core streams of what those services are that's being provided, right? So I'll give you at a high level, at the state level and the local level. So state level, there is taxes. If a state collects state taxes, there's taxes. There is the DMV or the RMV for driver's license. So those are two which impacts almost every single citizen. But beyond those two, maybe education becomes the third component, where by and large, most children are in public schools. Most constituents are going to have by and large, they would have children going into those public schools. So there is an impact to that. But the schooling ends up being funded more at a local level than at a state level. So these three are almost a given and almost steady state, no matter who comes into power, right? So even if an administration changes every 4 years or every 8 years, people come in. So those projects, policies are always going to be a steady state. On the technology side, if you shift, let's say AI. So I'll take AI as an example. If you go back 5-6 years ago, in terms of visibility into what goes on into an AI tool was probably a little scary for governments. So there was a political component which went into it. As was the case with cloud migration, to public cloud migration. Once they've seen an adoption in the public space and they see benefits in terms of how with an increasingly aging workforce, and that's a component we should talk about in government, where the aging workforce, technology becomes a substitute for the aging workforce. And this tends to be like something which is much more adaptable. So even if administrations change, moving to an AWS or a Azure cloud is not something they would come in and change as a policy. That's not at a policy level. It's going to be only on programs. So a new administration coming in might have slightly different programs they want to prioritize. So where the challenge comes in might be the capital funding, which goes into projects. Because at the end of the day, it's the same capital dollars that goes to build roads and bridges as what might be needed for like a new software or technology component that comes in. So that's an area where like there might be a little bit of a friction between how things need to be implemented from a CIO's perspective versus what the administration wants to do. But at this point in time, when you think about most executive heads in states or cities or towns, where those could be mayors or town managers, they understand the huge benefit of what technology does and want to make sure they have the right kind of resources to be able to implement those technologies, whether it's using Google or like using Microsoft 365 versus trying to build out like individual productivity tools within an organization, which could be much more expensive.
Yeah, related thing there is the use of open source in government solutions. There have been debates, there have been things about the data privacy or the security and so on, where you want to build walls, everything has to be only within the organization, in this case the government, versus being able to share, build upon something that is there, or more importantly, contribute what has been created by, let's say, a team that can be used by others. How prevalent is that, and what are your thoughts on that?
So open source, so there have been experiments within government of like using open source, whether it's just using open source as a technology, or they have been really aspirational groups outside of government which want to come in and help government, right? So there is, people might have heard of like Code for America. So that's an organization which comes in, takes on challenges which governments are facing, especially for smaller government entities which don't have the resources. So Code for America has a group of volunteers who might be working in commercial organizations. So they could be employed by Apple or Google, but then those larger private organizations give a certain percentage of the employees' time to go do public good. So these individuals would come in and help out doing organizations. And I'd draw the comparison between just using open source software and using these free resources to do the work as well. Challenge with both of those in government is there is no continuity. So if we have these open source tools that are being used to implement a solution, there is support that's needed. There's some kind of indemnification that needs to be done if a software doesn't work. So in terms of having that support organization, having resources within government organizations which get trained, and one challenge with open source is like there would be updates that happen on an ongoing basis. Every few years, there might be a big refresh. So who's going to then manage these? And government organizations very rarely have like large software development organizations built in. Most of these are outsourced, or like these could be like staff augmentation, which happens in government. And so that over time becomes a liability and a huge challenge. So even though there have been experiments done in the past with open source solutions, it's not worked to scale because of these challenges which they tend to have. In my past life, when I was working in government, we'd done these kind of the Code for Boston or like Code for America kind of organizations to come in and help out. But once they develop a product, there is no ongoing DevOps group or like support group which can help us out. And that becomes a bigger challenge.
To some extent, even if it is not completely like the open source movement where there are maintainers and there are people who are committed to that particular, say, technology or the solution. Do you think it is possible for this kind of sharing to happen across countries, even if, let's say, the cultural or linguistic or political differences are there, some of the core services that are needed for citizens, uh, do you think there is some amount of transferability or reusability?
Are you asking about it from the technology side or like more in terms of data sharing?
Technology side. Data sharing,
Okay,
I'm sure, will be restricted to those
right, exactly.
countries and so on. Yeah.
Right. In terms of technology, absolutely. So I can give specific examples of large commercial companies like Salesforce. Let's take Salesforce as an example. They have like a free service that's available to a limited extent. Obviously, there's like resources that are going to be spent depending on how big the implementations are for people to use at the back end. So Salesforce does provide both from a data visualization side as well as sharing data as a platform um, at at no cost to government entities, as long as it's public data and like how it's being provided uh, here. And there are a lot of smaller government entities which tend to use those kind of free services.
Okay.
So technology companies are doing it more as a public good. And also over time, I think once they build the rapport with the local state or local entities, they could then start adding value added services to that and like maybe make it something bigger. This is, if I can give you an old adage, Sun Microsystems used to do this in like colleges back in the day. They used to give like free hardware. All the students would like start developing things on like Sun systems. And then once they go into the commercial world, then they would be the big proponents of Sun systems within those organizations as well. So that could certainly be a win-win, both for the government entities and for larger companies.
I'm not sure if you've heard of this initiative in India, which we call as the India Stack. There's a movement where there are some government agencies also participating, and it's also done by the IT industry, various organizations, to build a stack that is, say, more of a digital public good, creating various platforms or various enabling technologies that can be used across India. Some states have started adopting that and saying that we would only want to use those kinds of platforms or the open source based things, and then kind of build it and then start sharing. One of the biggest examples is what you call this UPI, or the Universal Payment Interface, which has become a huge success. And then now there are some other countries also that have started adopting this. So the power or the impact that you can create by sharing or by focused application of all these limited resources that state agencies have. There are some initial results that are very encouraging. So I was just thinking that at a global scale, if some departments or some countries are ahead and particularly adopting technologies and so on. So that is where this question was, whether there is such a platform for exchange.
So I'm not aware of any platforms here in the US to that scale. There are certain instances where the federal government is starting to do start providing some services, which then states can start leveraging. So one of the areas I've come across more recently is there's a service through the federal government called login.gov. So this is purely for an individual's authentication. So there's a lot of identity fraud which happens with like government services. So at a federal level, because they have access to a lot of data, whether it's like an individual's tax information, it could be their passport information. So now, if I need to authenticate myself as the individual coming in to leverage some service within a state or local entity, I could piggyback off of that login.gov. And so when I go in and like put in my credentials, it's going to authenticate me, and then like it'll pass the token back to the state or local entity for that system to be able to leverage. So that's probably one area I can think of on the identity side, because there is a lot of uh, disparity between states, how that information is handled, where it's handled. And then there are certain services which might be portable across states as well. But that's more of a service versus having a tech stack. I think that's what you're referring to, where people could use those APIs or like those components to build out applications. I'm not aware of anything that's available at a federal level. Between state and local, there is a lot more of that interaction that happens. One of the things is a lot of municipalities are like small. So if you take, for example, where I live, Massachusetts, Boston's a big city. There are like 3 or 4 other big cities which can support and like have their own large IT organizations and like significantly large IT budgets. But when you go from those top 4 or 5 communities, then you start getting into like much smaller cities and towns which don't have the resources. So they then tend to pool together. And in other instances, they pool together with the state to either build out systems or to get these kind of like some standards to come in. But this again would be at a product level, but not at like a software or like an API which they can start using to build things out, because they don't have the human resources to be able to build out, maintain, and manage those applications.
You had mentioned in earlier part of your career also of as being a consultant, and also now when you mentioned that you are supporting various government departments and your team does all that. So how did this consulting or the startup bug bite you?
Again, this was another accident. So when I was my last role in government, we had, in fact, this could be an interesting segue for your audience as well. So IT up to that point in that administration or like prior administrations was within the finance organization. So IT was always looked at as a cost center, no matter like what was getting done versus value add. So with the last administration I was part of, there was a significant change made to have IT elevated to an executive office. So pretty much IT had a seat at the table as a separate secretariat. So as part of that work that was going on, one of the things we needed to do was go into different lines of business within the states, which are called the secretariats. I don't know if it's a similar setup in India. So each of those secretariats had to have something done. So rather than trying to mandate within those secretariats to go in and say what they should do, whatever functions they have, certain things need to be moved to the enterprise. But if it's a business function that is very specific to the agency, then they keep it within, right? So rather than mandating, we decided to second resources from the central IT organization into those organizations. So not only would we be able to be good champions of what needs to be propagated within those agencies, we would also be sitting with those agency resources, monitoring what's going on within that and try and understand better like what's going on within those groups. So this was like an early indicator of what was happening at that point. This was like in 2016-17 timeframe. In the private sector, when you look at something comparable, you have the interim CXOs, right? So there are a CEO or a CIO or a CFO who gets hired for a short-term basis. The value proposition this business had at that point, at least what we were toying with, is in government, when a new administration comes in, you have a lot of people who come in with the governor who are mission oriented, but within like 2 to 3 years time, they want to go back to their day job, right? But then the governor within that state still has work that needs to get done over the next 2 years, or like if they get reelected for another 4 years. Hiring new people into those roles takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months. And so we kind of thought there is a value add or like a void that gets built in. We could go in and help them with the ongoing operational aspects, also helping them hire somebody into those longer term roles. So that's kind of where this whole idea came to be. It's not new because it's been tried and tested in the private sector, but it's new in the government space. There are certain caveats which come in with government, which doesn't exist in the private sector. But other than that, the idea was pretty similar. And then when COVID hit, this became a reality because like there was a lot of need for these kind of roles. And then in a post-COVID world, obviously, it's been tested out. Obviously, there is enough support for these kind of resources to come in and help out within government as well.
So when you come in as, let's say, a fixer or somebody who needs to maintain continuity and so on, two aspects. One is as a CXO role, relationships are very important. Building the trust, gaining the trust of all the departments and doing that. So when somebody comes from outside, are there any formulas or something that has worked for you to get them engaged and then establish the trust quickly? And part two is that now, typically as a consultant, you need to also show results quickly. But at the same time, the consideration for right-sizing the technology, what is appropriate based on the magnitude of the challenge or the budgets and so on. So how do you address these aspects?
So the first aspect, coming into a new organization, as I said, almost all of the work we do is like state and local government. And the landscape in terms of what services are being offered is not a secret, right? So this is all publicly available information. So prior to going in and like starting engaging on day one, try to do as much of like research, because everything is public, to know like what's going on. So if it's a specific agency within that government, you can go onto their website, see what the organizational structure is, what kind of resources are there, not in terms of the exact resources within the organization, but what services are being provided, right? So you can then like start looking at, you click on a link, you see, okay, I see this is going into like AWS. So like, I know they're using AWS in here. So you can kind of do that work. So we always build out on like that small portfolio. So whether it's me or like any of the other consultants in our organization, we go in and build that playbook of saying, okay, this looks like it's the landscape. The second piece we look at is, okay, how experienced are these resources within those organizations? And how much are they vested in like the technology side versus just or on the business or the operations side? So those are like the softer aspects we try to like put into our playbook. So going in, we have this, and then within a first few days or like a couple of weeks, like based on your initial playbook, if it's according to plan or like if something's changing. So we start iterating that plan and look at it. Very seldom in the last almost 5 years since we've been in existence, we've seen any major surprises. The challenges are that like we're not the only ones who are coming in as consultants and like everybody else is like captive within the organization. We're dealing with like multiple consulting organizations. So the consultants could be vendors, it could be system integrators, it could be any of the big 4, big 5 consultants who are there like providing strategic feedback or analysis for those organizations. So the second aspect I would say is that having the right kind of temperament to work with them. Almost all the people in our organization are people like me who've been in government, who kind of understand like balances between what goes on within those government agencies, how it works, what kind of technology landscape there is. So these are all like seasoned people who've had at least like 10 to 15 years of experience in that space. So they come in with a fair amount of experience, life experience, as well as career experience to be able to handle those crowds. There is always going to be a challenge with like individual egos or like ideas, but that is no different in a private sector organization either, right? So you're kind of mapping and like trying to figure out how you manage those challenges. But outside of that, like these are probably the few large areas to look into. On the right sizing piece of technology, that is a much longer discussion and process. unless you have sponsors within the organization who completely get it, um, and they have the leverage to talk to those individual departments to scale back or scale up based on what's going on within the challenges, it's a challenge. So that's a much longer conversation within those organizations. Sometimes we as in my company is not able to like finish the right sizing within the time of engagement. But in other instances, if we have a longer engagement, we're able to have those conversations and help them out as well. And in government, as a general rule, if things are working, and by and large, there is no challenges externally, things would just continue to move on the same way. So which is why like you tend to find systems, they're not changing systems because technology is changing. They're changing systems because of an inherent challenge they have, or they're not able to scale. That's probably when like they start looking at changes. And then the procurement cycles are much longer in government. So that tends to take time as well. So typically in the private sector, what you could accomplish within 3 months from a procurement perspective could take 6 to 9 months or even longer in government.
Now, I think we're coming towards the end of the conversation, but I have to ask you about some career tips for two segments of people. One, those who are considering a career in IT, and those who've been in IT for a while and then now looking to do something different, or the itch to do something different, which could be either a mid-career crisis or maybe the urge to create some impact. We can probably limit this to the government sector, somebody who wants to enter the government. Because as you said, one thought that crossed my mind was if a government job is not going to be as the bleeding edge of technology all the time, how do you attract, or as an aspirant to get into IT, why should I still choose that? And second thing, of course, is whether I'm in the government wanting to move out and do something, or somebody who's not been in the government but want to contribute, how could I get into any of those roles?
Got it. Actually, there's a third piece to this as well. People who are like kind of done with like the commercial side who want to get into government. So there is that component as well, who want some stability, some normalcy of going in. So, and we are seeing increasingly that range as well. So there's two dynamics I should talk about before talking about those three segments of people. One is it is an aging workforce in government. So if you go back again, like 20, 30 years, probably people got into government because of like certain benefits they might get, or like it's a lot more stable in terms of how those jobs are. But that's definitely changed in the last 15, 20 years. So for somebody entering into government, it's a great environment to learn. You have a captive audience of like, so again, I'm talking about state or local governments where the entire constituency of the city or town they're going to be working in, or the entire state, is a captive audience. You're providing services for so many people. There is a mission-driven component which comes into it. And we do see a lot of people getting into this at the early stages of their career because they want to impact public policy. Let's say they want to go in and like learn about what the inner workings of government are. So I would say in an early career perspective for technology folks to come in, you can experience multiple sides of government coming in. And there is multiple technologies as well. Yes, it might not be the latest technology or like the bleeding edge, but it's still within like a 3 to 4 year mapping, right? In terms of the technology you're using or like you're trying to help support. In terms of the front end stuff, it's all still the same. I mean, everybody's on the latest mobile devices or like laptops and the security software that goes, the IAMPs. Cybersecurity is one area where governments tend to be in the bleeding edge side of things as well, because that becomes sacrosanct in terms of protection of the individual's data. So in the cybersecurity space, I would certainly say government is a great place to work in. For mid-career folks coming into government or getting out of government, is you have built an experience of working with a diverse set of people, diverse organization. That soft skill becomes a huge value add going into the private sector. There are a lot of companies these days, especially what I mentioned earlier in a post-COVID world, who are getting a government because they do see like governments are acting faster. There's a lot more funding government has now to help procure more of these services from the private sector. And the private sector needs those individuals who have government experience, who come in, who can navigate through the government space. So that's an area they could certainly jump into. Almost every large company has a public sector, the SLED, state, local, education department. So the SLED area is like a huge growing business for a lot of these companies. For people who are pretty much done at this point with the commercial side and want to move into government, they probably have a lot to give to government. So government is looking for them to attract people right out of college. Obviously, it's a huge challenge. But for those people who've had like a good stint in the private sector, who want some kind of stability, not have too much of travel, and who want to come in and like give back, it's a stable environment, and they do get a lot of benefits at that level in government, which they might want to have. Let's say they're empty nesters at this point. Kids have all left and like gone to college or like doing bigger and better things. That's an area they can come back in and contribute a lot more into the government space as well.
Yeah, that's actually very reassuring and also sounds attractive as an option. Yeah. So on that positive note, thank Karthik for sharing your story and your perspectives. And it's definitely, I learned a lot about how government systems work and how to work with government systems as well.
Thanks a lot. Nice talking to you.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.